All right, everybody. I am very excited for today's conversation. We have the privilege of speaking with Ivelisse Page. We're going to do this in 3 parts. And so, depending on where you're jumping into this process, make sure to start at one because we are going to dive into Ivelisse's personal story. And so, just a little bit about her. She beat cancer not only once, but twice, and the second time pretty recently. So, we'll talk about that. She has turned her story into a powerful movement to help others and to give back to the community that she was thrust into, like so many of us have been. We met Ivelisse first through a mutual friend in Dr. Nasha Winters and had an opportunity to speak with her last year now about our story and the vision behind the Cancer Box on her incredible podcast, which I will make sure to link below. But Ivelisse is the co-founder and executive director of an organization called Believe Big. And on top of that, she's also working to establish an incredible state-of-the-art research hospital called the Believe Big Institute of Health, which is focusing on the best of modern science and ancient therapies really married together, which is super, super exciting. So I'm definitely getting ahead of myself because we'll talk about each of these things. But Ivelisse, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Jameson, thanks for having me. Thank you and Rachel for all that you guys do with the Cancer Box and the resources you offer our community. So really appreciate you as well. Thank you.
I think we all just have a desire to give back to a community that really gave us so much when we needed it.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so I'm excited to first dive into really your personal story. So if you don't mind, take us back to 2008 and walk us through how your journey in the cancer world began.
Yeah, so at that time, I was a busy mom of 4. I was homeschooling during the day and running my business at night. And I just really found myself so fatigued that I was taking 3-hour naps in the middle of the day, every single day. And for a while, I just thought I was burning the candle at both ends. Many moms do. And I finally realized when summer arrived and I was still exhausted that something was wrong. And my family had a history of colon cancer, so I knew it was a possibility. But I had been diligent about getting regular colonoscopies. I knew the signs to look out for. And actually, I had not been experiencing any of them.
Interesting.
But yes, and that's what was really crazy about that. Both stories, actually.
Yeah.
But still, I went to see a doctor. My husband insisted that he said the exhaustion is just not normal. And fast forward, it led me to running a series of tests. And I was lying in bed at the surgery center when my doctor walked in, and I could just tell by the look on his face that something was wrong. I know you probably remember that moment as well.
Yep, very much so.
And he told me, you know what, no one wants to hear, and it's, we found cancer. And honestly, Jameson, I started crying and I couldn't stop because at that moment I was filled with fear of the thought of not seeing my 4 kids grow up or growing old with my college sweetheart, Jimmy. And I also flashed back to when I was 13, when I lost my father to cancer. And interestingly enough, I had spent my entire life trying to avoid that moment. And yet here I was, diagnosed at the same age with the same type of cancer that took his life, my grandmother's life, and half of her siblings. And I was only 37 at the time, so that seemed very hopeless.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting how, when from that moment, and this is in our experience as well, the moment that you find out, it really is interesting what it drums up in terms of past experiences with cancer and where your brain almost instantly goes in that moment. I think it really identifies what you think your identity is, right? For you, it was as a mother, as a wife, and having this history in my family. And I think for us and for Rachel, it was similar.
Yes.
A lot of parity between our stories.
Yes, there is.
Yeah. So where did you go from there? So you have that moment where the doctor says it's cancer. What were your first few steps?
Yeah. So at that moment, literally, I was coming face to face, literally with the reality that my days were numbered because they told me that at my stage 4, I had a less than 8% chance of survival.
Hmm.
And after asking several questions, I decided not to do chemo and radiation as it would not have improved my odds of survival.
Hmm.
But I did do surgeries. And as at home, as I was recovering from surgeries, I would look over at night and I would see my husband searching the internet for anything that could help me. And honestly, he wasn't finding very much. And this is back in the days where phones you didn't have iPhones, this was 14 years ago, believe it or not. And you just could text, but, you had very minimal use of internet,
Hmm.
really desktop. But during this time, we actually met with a physician who told us about mistletoe therapy.
Mm.
And who would have thought, honestly, that the plant that we see at Christmas time was used around the world to treat cancer? And at that point, I was honestly willing to try anything. But because therapies like that were not covered by insurance,
Hmm.
I was worried that I wouldn't be able to afford it. And we couldn't, but a community of people really encircled and helped to save my life.
Mm.
And
That's
were
amazing.
willing to give of their resources so that I could get a second chance. And the therapy and the other things that I incorporated into my healing journey, it worked. And I'll forever be grateful to the Lord and for that community of people who were a part of me being here today.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Mhm.
So let's unpack that in a couple pieces because I'm excited to talk
Yeah.
about different aspects of that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the surgeries, where did that leave you, maybe prognosis wise, post surgery? What were you able to remove? What was kind of left behind? What were you dealing with?
Yeah. So it had stage 4 colon. So it had spread to my liver. So I
Mhm.
had to have my colon resected. And then I also had to have liver surgery, which they removed 20% of my liver. Now, the good news for me, though, was that because it was isolated, the 3 areas were isolated, they could do surgery with clear margins. So
Cool.
that was really good for me.
Yeah.
But when I went back 10 weeks post op, I remember walking into my oncologist's office and I had had my scans and everything at that time. And I asked him, I said, okay, 10 weeks out, what do you typically see? What are my chances that that I'm free
Mhm.
of this still? And he's like, you really want to know? And I was like, I do. I
Yeah.
really want to know. And he says, well, at this point, 75% of the time, 10 weeks out, the cancer's already back in the liver.
Mm.
And I was just like shocked. And I looked over at my husband and I just praised God for him because he was just such a rock.
Mm.
And he was kind of like that lightning rod that takes those lightning bolts and helps to neutralize it. And he looked over at me and he just said, Ivelisse, you're going to be part of that 25%.
Mm.
And I was like, I am. You're right. I had to remember that.
Yeah.
And sure enough, not a few minutes later, the reports of the scans came back, and
Mm.
he's like, "Time to celebrate." He goes, "There's no evidence of disease."
That's
And
amazing.
I was celebrating. Then we came back 3 months later, no evidence of disease. 3 months after that, and then 6 months, and then every year, no evidence of disease. And then they released me 5 years
Wow.
after that.
Yep.
Mhm.
That's
Yes.
incredible. That's incredible.
Y
So
yes.
where in that to that 10-week mark where you had kind of your first NED, no evidence of disease,
Mhm.
where in that time frame did you start mistletoe?
I started it, after my colon resection, but before my liver surgery.
Okay,
They're a few weeks apart. And so I started about 2 weeks prior to my surgery.
got
I
it.
had also, at that point, had started with some off-label drugs, right before my colon resection,
Mhm.
and I was on cimetidine, which,
Mhm.
is an H2 blocker neutralizer, and so it helps prevent metastasis. So I know that that really helped me as well.
Got it. Very
Hmm.
cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right that your story and your experience is not the norm, unfortunately. Um, but walk me through a little bit how your faith played a role in
Mm.
those early days, maybe even before surgeries and things, just in the processing of that.
Yeah, e even this last, diagnosis, it
Mm,
really brought me back to my real healing, and honestly, Jameson, you and Rachel understand how faith plays such an important role
mhm,
in this journey. You know, we all have a need to control or to want a certain outcome, but honestly, our lives are not really in our hands, and I still remember, going through this process with Jimmy and laying everything before and praying about it, and we were especially for the caregiver that feels such a tremendous responsibility to find everything, to research everything.
mm,
And I remember that Jimmy looked at me and he's like, "You know what, Ivelisse? We can do everything right
mm.
and you can still die.
Yeah,
And we can do everything wrong and you can live.
yeah,
Ultimately, your life is in God's hands. And do we trust him no matter how this turns out?" And for me as a Christian, I know that this is not the end. And this is not my home as much as I want it to be. I want to be here as long as possible, but I know that this is not my home. And my purpose is to honor him in everything I say and do. And, my actual healing journey started the day that I found out that it had spread to my liver.
mm,
And I was on the way to my friend's 40th birthday. And my husband's like, "Well, I guess we need to cancel that." And I said, "No, we're going. We're not going to let this stop us. Are you kidding?" So we went down to the celebration.
mm,
We were surrounded by friends, loved ones. And in the middle of that, an aspect that many of us don't focus in on, and one aspect that we're really focusing on at Believe Big this year is the emotional side and spiritual side of healing. I think we can all be so focused on the physical and doing all the right things that we miss out on so many aspects of our past, of our hurts, of things that have affected us that we haven't really resolved and have buried, and
yeah,
ends up hindering our healing processes.
yeah,
And during that time, one of our friends said, Ivelisse, you grew up in a home that I'm from Puerto Rico that really got into some not new age practices, but some practices that were not of God. And I thought that was all in the past. And my mom went to see a palm reader and all these kinds of things from the
yeah,
past. And he goes, "I just really feel like the Lord wants us to pray and to pray for you." And I was like, "Pray for anything and everything."
yeah,
And so we took that time and we prayed. And I tell you, Jameson, that the Lord revealed to me that I had unforgiveness in
mm,
my heart. And interestingly enough, I was investigating the spiritual roots of disease. And actually, with colon cancer, it's unforgiveness.
yeah.
And it
Interesting.
was fascinating to me. And honestly, as a person of faith, I never even thought that I was holding unforgiveness
Mm,
until that time of prayer. And to me, honestly, it was unforgiveness towards God, nonetheless. And in that process, I realized that I had bitterness and unforgiveness towards God for abuse that I'd had when I was little, for my dad. Um, losing my dad to cancer, I thought God was going to heal him, and I prayed as a little girl that he would be healed, and he was healed, but in heaven. And then I had unforgiveness because I would thought I was doing all the right things, and I still got sick.
mm,
And I tell you, after that time of prayer, I felt um, a, like a calmness and a ease that I had never felt
mm,
ever in my years of being a believer. And I know that that was the beginning of my healing journey.
mm. So all of that came to the surface in that one kind of time of prayer with that group.
Yes,
Wow.
yes, yes,
It does not
yes.
take much soul searching when you ask to,
No.
that God answers when you say, "God, show me myself, please."
Yes. Yeah. He just says, no, you know my thoughts.
Hmm.
You know what's within my heart. Search me, O Lord, search my heart and know my ways. You know my ways. And so in the mornings, it's funny, it's a practice that I ask the Lord, is there anything that I need to work on? Is there some emotional things that I unintentionally buried? Reveal these things to me so that it is not hindering
Hmm.
my future and my health.
Yeah, that's an interesting process. Something Rachel went through. I actually was just reading a draft blog post that she's writing right now.
Mm,
I was doing a kind of review, and her writing always impresses me. But
Mm.
she was talking about that process that she went through, and I remember in those first maybe 3 to 6 months after the diagnosis, she was having a series of dreams, not nightmares, just stress dreams about things in childhood, old relationships that had gone to the wayside, conflicts and things. And she kind of came to a realization that she needed to process and deal with that, where she had maybe wronged people, nothing really
Mm.
big,
Right.
um,
Hmm.
but just things where maybe a childhood friend, she wasn't a good friend to them, and felt guilt for that. And so she went on a little journey of identifying those things, and then reaching out to those people, again, in many cases decades after the fact, and reconciling those things. And it was such a cool thing to kind of watch from the outside as her husband, um, just that process of the connection between spiritual and physical healing.
Yes. I mean, it literally, there's been scientific studies that have been done on the fight or flight,
Yep.
and and that's what happens when we are holding those things emotionally. Our cells can't even absorb water. You can be drinking
Yep.
60 ounces of water and they're not absorbing it because it's in a sympathetic mode and not
Yep.
a
It's not
parasympathetic
letting you
mode.
switch. Yep. Yep.
No. Hmm.
Yeah. You talked about, it was a couple minutes ago now, Jimmy's quote of, "You could do all the right things and still go to heaven, and you could you could do all the wrong things and survive and be healed." I think that was maybe one of the more difficult things for us to process, because you talk about the state of the internet 14 years ago, 13 years ago. Um, when we started this journey 5.5 years ago, there was a lot more information out there, and very readily available at our fingertips at all times. We had hundreds of people messaging us, "Try this, try this. I heard this work. This is something you could do." And whether it's just mental capacity having limitations, or financial limitations, or whatever it might be, you had to recognize really quickly you can't do it all. And so now you have to choose what's important. What should I do? What do I believe is effective? And what do I believe may not be effective? And that just process of really culling through that, and processing those things, I think we really quickly recognized was almost more of a conscience decision than a practical intellectual decision. And the problem is, we're not doctors and we're not scientists, and so I'm trusting somebody, right? When I see that,
Hmm.
even mistletoe, if we take that, if I say, well, mistletoe seems to be effective, well, I'm trusting the people who did the tests and ran the studies, and see the anecdotal evidence of its results, because I'm not doing that. And so I'm putting my trust in something, in saying that is the thing I'm going to pursue over this, or this. And so for us, I think we found a lot of peace in saying we want to pray about our decisions and recognize, are these within our conscience? Do these feel right? I know it's kind of touchy feely, but to some extent, it's like, if there are 100 things and I can only do 10, um, do I feel good about the 10 that I'm doing? Do I feel at peace that I'm being responsible, that I'm being wise with what God's given us? And then just let the cards fall as they may, because God's in charge of the cards. I'm not. Um, and so, yeah, I think it's an interesting balance you have to strike. And I genuinely, I mean, this is a little bit off topic, but I genuinely can't imagine, I can't put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't have a faith connection, that doesn't have a God of the Bible that they can trust and look to, how they come to those decisions. And I think we've seen, and maybe you've seen, how that can cause some chaos, and hopelessness and discouragement, because it's not that you don't have options; it's almost you have way too many options, um, and ultimately, it's not your decision what's going to happen anyway.
Yes, and I would encourage for those people who are listening is to keep that circle small,
Mm,
and I think that's kind of what Jimmy and I did,
yep.
and I think that, like you and Rachel did, is to pray about it and God will reveal to you. But I also feel like it's an opportunity for people who don't know the Lord,
Mm,
to really, and that's one of the beautiful things at Believe Big is that people come to us for physical help, and we are very, conscious of the fact that people are coming from all different faiths and backgrounds, and we welcome everyone. But we get asked those questions of how did you fight off the fear?
mm,
How do you know? And I think that that's when we can step in and hold their hand and
yeah.
say, "Come along with us on this journey, and we'll kind of teach you and show you the ways that really brought true peace,
Yeah.
not
'Cause that's
temporary
such a
peace."
spiritual question,
Hmm.
right? I think in today's modern world, we've unspiritualized questions about our emotions and our feelings,
Yes.
and our health.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. And even what we call, the Holy Spirit, that gut feeling that people know deep down, or mother's intuition, we've heard all of those things. And I think each individual just knows, like, even before I prayed, I just knew in my heart, Jameson, that chemotherapy was not for me. I knew it would do me more harm than good. I just had this feeling. I couldn't tell you why. I didn't have the scientific studies. I just had this gut feeling, and I know that was the Holy Spirit for me
mm,
personally telling me that was not the path.
mm.
And everyone has to make their own decisions and what's best for them. Interestingly enough, years later, I find out that my genetic makeup, it would have caused more harm than good for me
Oh,
because
interesting.
of how I process out chemicals. So then I did do the scientific thing
Right.
post
You
years
got the
later.
answers.
I got the answers,
Huh.
that wonderful nutrition genome that
Mhm.
kinda tells you things to work on your strengths and your weaknesses, and I was just like, "There it is.
There
There's
it
the
is.
there's the proof later."
Yep.
So, yes.
Got it. Very cool. Very cool.
Mhm.
So, what has your journey with mistletoe been since? Because we'll spend some time on the science of mistletoe. I'm excited to dive into that, but in a future
Yes.
topic. So,
Yeah.
you started mistletoe very, very early on. Have you continued indefinitely? Did you take breaks? Kind of what has that looked like?
It's interesting because 'cause I'm kind of like the, longest test case maybe, I'm
Yeah,
not sure,
of
but,
course, probably.
again, you just do what feels best for you,
Mm,
and I just really felt for me, especially with my genetics and with the staging, that I was gonna be on it forever, and
mm,
I just adjusted it. Once my body got accustomed to it, I would go to a higher dose, but I was very closely monitored all those years by my integrative practitioner who also specialized in mistletoe therapy.
mhm.
I would love to make sure to note to people that it's never just one thing, and I know you share that with your audience. It's not just, "Oh, I just need mistletoe and I'll be
Yeah.
healed," or, "I just need surgery, I'll be healed." I just need It is really an individualized approach to what each person needs.
Yep.
And that's why I'm kind of careful of not sharing exactly all the supplements I take and
Yeah.
all the things that I do, because everybody as an individual needs different things. And your chemical makeup is different. And even with the same type of cancer, you're going to need different modalities to heal. But yeah, so I, over the course of time, changed my mistletoe and increased it based on what was needed.
Mhm.
And, and yeah, and up to this last year, everything, it actually kept. One of the benefits of mistletoe is that it prevents recurrence.
Yeah.
And this diagnosis that I had in the fall was not a recurrence. So it
Mhm.
did keep that colon cancer at bay. Interestingly enough, I was told that my grandmother had a recurrence of colon cancer, several cancers, um, and I didn't. So
Mm.
that really kept me healthy
Yeah.
all those years, 14 years, um, and while I was being closely monitored, by my integrative doctors and conventional doctors due to my Lynch syndrome. So yeah, so then we tweaked it and we changed it, and now I'm on a different one, post surgery,
Mhm.
that is now has equal amounts of immune boosting properties and cancer fighting properties.
Awesome. Awesome. So this is probably a good transition. You mentioned something happening in the fall.
Mhm.
Kind of walk us through, yeah, 14 years later, what's been going on in your life from a health standpoint.
Yeah, so, I mentioned also the importance of emotional health, self-care,
Mhm.
and I think that those of us in this world, and depending on you as an individual, we can pour out to excess,
Mm,
and I was doing that. And interestingly enough, I went out on sabbatical at the end of May because I knew that I reached a point of burnout, and
mm,
I knew I needed to reset and restore. My word for the year that this past year was restore.
mhm,
And I went on sabbatical, and honestly, Jameson, my doctors were even shocked because my labs, my eating habits, all of my physical habits were stellar.
mm,
No, none of my markers went up. None of my sauna, everything that I
mhm,
was doing to look out for the cancer was not found. I mean, it was normal. And I was going through this time too of going through menopause, and I just thought it was a change of life.
mm,
And some of the symptoms that I was having with that became a concern where she was like, you know what, let's just do this test, which led to another test. And because of my healthy practices, which I'm super grateful, they discovered that I had endometrial cancer,
mm.
um, but it was stage 1A, which was the very earliest, the
Very
very
early. Yeah.
beginning that you can potentially catch this. And I was told by the surgeon that with endometrial cancers, even if you do internal sonograms and blood work every 6 months, I was doing it every year, but every 6 months, typically don't catch endometrial cancer until it's at least stage 2 or 3.
Wow.
I
Wow.
was like, what?
Yeah.
So it's just incredible. But I know right back again that I was perfect storm
Mm,
of stress, which causes your cortisol levels to rise, which causes insulin and to rise and release, and disruption of my hormones,
mm.
and added to the fact I was going through menopause. And honestly,
It was a
it
perfect
was just
storm.
perfect storm.
Yeah.
But you know what? I just go back and I think of the graces of God
Mm,
during that time, because we did catch it early. My healthy practices did catch it early. And he gave this, unlike the first time, I had a complete peace. And my husband doesn't like me saying this, but I would say, I'm not scared of the cancer at all.
mm,
And I said, I was more concerned about the surgery because I had such bad experiences. And he's like, "How can you not be concerned? It's cancer." And I was like, "Because I know what to do. I
mm,
know that it's early." I had a peace because of what the work we've done at Believe Big and all the things that I've done over the years. I knew exactly who to call. I knew exactly what to do physically, and I was at complete peace on that side.
mhm.
And God redeemed my surgery story, because this time it was unbelievably well and
That's great.
above what we thought. So, yes.
That's great. How do you feel like now that you've gone through the full process of two cancer diagnoses, which I think
Mhm,
is not common, how would you compare yourself 14 years ago getting
mm.
one diagnosis to yourself this last fall getting the second?
Yeah, I think, 1, I was so grateful that I discovered this at the end of my sabbatical
Mm,
versus at the beginning, where I wasn't emotionally,
sure.
in a place that could handle it as well. I think I was rested. I was ready for what was ahead. I had peace. And I
Mm,
think that's the biggest, not that I didn't have peace before, but I struggled a lot with fear that first time, because of my family history, because of my dad and my grandmother's and her siblings'
mhm,
outcomes, because it was stage 4. There was so many bad news after bad news after bad news.
yeah.
And I think this time, I just felt a more of a peace of knowing
Mm,
that it was early and that I knew what to do. Um, but although I had a different situation this time where God stretched me, because I didn't have all my medical team, I didn't have all my contacts that I had on the East Coast. So I understand what patients are going through when they're
Mm,
saying, "Oh my gosh, who do I call? How do I know they're a good doctor?" Because here I am in Colorado now and not having the connections that I did with Hopkins and University of Maryland and all
yeah,
those wonderful hospital systems. But you know what? As we prayed, as I researched and did all the things that we asked people to do, was interviewing and asking them the questions, you were able to select,
yeah.
the best person for your care. And we did. We found an excellent surgeon here.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to sometimes be able to test your own medicine. Hey, here's
Yes.
what I tell everybody else to do. Am I going to do it?
Yes.
That's good. That's good. Well, the final question I had for you on this topic was, and we're going to talk about Believe Big as an organization in a moment. But what was that process for you and Jimmy to come to the decision to help others in a really unique way by starting Believe
Mm,
Big? What did that journey look like for you?
mm. Well, I think as we sat around and looking at all the things that people around us were experiencing once I was well, we realized that there are several problems. That once a person is diagnosed, they're immediately rushed on a conveyor belt of treatment with only three options:
Hmm.
chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. They don't realize that their care should be individualized and not standardized.
Hmm.
And many times people don't think they have time to investigate other options, not knowing that it typically takes cancer 7 to 10 years to grow in the first place. And then lastly, I think patients were so overwhelmed that just with being diagnosed that they weren't even sure of what questions to ask, and that there was a better way that they could complement the treatments and have a great quality of life,
Hmm.
and not just quantity of life. So all of those things led us to really starting Believe Big, where patients who are in this overwhelm could have the resources and access to treatments that could help them as a whole person, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well.
Hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. You're right that there is this sense of urgency that I think really drives you away from making careful decisions and drives you toward potentially reckless decisions or just missing out on information. I think there's also a temptation to feel like you have to choose. It's like there's the traditional American path, or there's this kind of ancient remedy naturopathic path. And I always appreciate people who go, that's a dichotomy that doesn't have to exist. There's best of all options that's unique to you, and let's talk about how you need a treatment plan for your specific situation, and that may include combinations from the best of all worlds. I won't even say both worlds, just all worlds.
Yes.
And so I think it's rare to find people and organizations that strike that balance well. And I'm sure you found, it's one of the hardest things in even finding a doctor is you talk to doctors on either side, and often they go, oh, they're awful over there. They're awful over there. And you go, okay, nope, sorry, I need a team here. And in that
Yes.
team, I need you to play nice. And so how do we find that integrative approach is
And they are
often.
there.
Yep.
And they are there. And honestly, the conventional doctors really do care, or they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
Same with the integrative doctors. And I think that more and more there's becoming a healthier respect for both sides.
Yeah.
But we really we want to be that bridge. We want to be that bridge that people can work together. We're always better together.
Yep. Amen. Amen. Well, I think that's the perfect teaser for our next conversation, which is going to be talking about Believe Big as an organization, what you're doing, what you've been doing, the journey that brought you today, and some exciting things coming up. So, Ivelisse, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I'm excited to continue our conversation in the next video.
Thanks, Jameson.